Welcome back to The Initiation, a podcast for those who sense we're living through a planetary turning point. A space to explore the converging crises, the emerging breakthroughs, and the inner and outer transformations needed to rise to the occasion. In this episode, we turn to the fourth breakdown force shaping our current moment, the unraveling of the US-led global order. Unlike past transitions from, let's say, the British Empire to the American dominance, for example, what we are seeing now may not be a simple handover. This moment points to something deeper, a structural unraveling of the old global world order and the emergence of a fundamentally new way of organizing power and coordination on a planetary scale. To understand why this is more than just the end of the American hegemony, we have to step back and look at the arc of empire itself. Ray Dalio, who has spent years studying the rise and fall of great powers, argues that empires tend to follow a fairly predictable cycle. They rise through productivity and innovation, they peak with wealth, influence, and military strength, and then, inevitably, they decline, often through rising debt, internal division, loss of manufacturing capacity, and the erosion of global trust. That cycle ends where it began, with the collapse of an old order and the slow, often painful emergence of something new. And if we look at the United States through that lens, it becomes difficult to deny. Many of the markers of imperial decline are already here. For example, over the last 50 years, the US has lost more than 2/3 of its manufacturing base. That's not just a shift in economic activity, it's a deep structural hollowing out. And it has profound implications, not just economically, but geopolitically. You can't sustain global dominance when your ability to produce and export has been outsourced to the rest of the world. This decline is closely tied to something economists call the Triffin Dilemma, a paradox built in the heart of the global financial system and a key force driving the weakening of the US power. So what exactly is the Triffin Dilemma? It's a contradiction at the heart of any global reserve currency system. In the United States, as the issuer of the dollar, has been living inside of that contradiction for decades. Here's how it works. In order for the world to have enough dollars for global trade and finance, the US has to export them. But how do you do that? How do you export dollars? Well, by importing goods. That means the US has run a trade deficit, buying more than it sells, essentially flooding the world with dollars in exchange for real goods and services. Over time, this creates a strange dynamic. The US becomes less productive while its debt and consumption levels go through the roof. Factories move overseas, wages stagnate, the country starts relying on debt to fuel its economy, and foreign nations end up holding trillions of dollars worth of US assets. Everything from treasury bonds to tech stocks. Meaning, as foreign countries export to the US, they take those dollars and reinvest them, usually in US debt or equities. This creates an artificial demand for treasuries and stocks, which helps keep borrowing costs low for American government, which sounds convenient until it isn't. Because here's what happens. The low borrowing costs encourage more borrowing. So the government racks up more debt, confident it can always find buyers. But eventually, those buyers start to pull back. In fact, China, once the largest holder of US debt, has been reducing its exposure since 2010. Japan is struggling under its own massive debt load. And Saudi Arabia, once a reliable financial ally, is now being courted by China and Russia to move away from the dollar entirely. This is where the cycle starts to spin out of control. As demand for US debt shrinks, interest rates rise. That rises the cost of borrowing, which balloons the federal deficit, which requires more borrowing, which again raises interest rates. It's sort of a feedback loop, a debt spiral. And remember, this all ties back to the need to supply the world with dollars. So that core function of being the global reserve currency has become the very thing hollowing out the US economy from the inside. It's not just theory. You can see it in the numbers. As mentioned before, the US has lost 2/3 of its manufacturing base in recent years. Entire industries have vanished. And now the financial scaffolding that's held everything together is beginning to really shake. In fact, Trump's tariffs are all about trying to reshore manufacturing back to the US and working against the effects of the Triffin Dilemma. However, as financial strains deepen, something else is quietly unraveling beneath the surface. Trust. Trust in institutions, trust in leadership, trust in the very system itself. In the 1970s, around 75% of Americans said they trusted the federal government to do what's right most of the time. Today, that number is below 20%. And remember, around 15% of the workforce work for the government. But this erosion of trust isn't just a political issue. It's a systemic signal, one that points to deeper dysfunction in how decisions are made, how power is distributed, and how feedback loops between the public and those in power have broken down. In a healthy society, trust is the social fabric that holds everything together. It's what allows for collective action, shared sacrifice, and coordinated responses to crises. Without trust, we get paralysis, polarization, collapse. This collapse of trust is mirrored in another crucial area, the health and well-being of the population itself. Another signal of systemic decline is showing up in one of the most intimate and undeniable indicators we have, how long people are living and how many are dying preventable deaths. Since 2014, life expectancy in the United States has been in the decline. Think about that. In one of the wealthiest nations in history, people are now expected to live shorter lives than they did a decade ago. That's not just a blip, that's a sign of a society in trouble. As of now, US life expectancy hovers around 76 years. It's lowest in nearly 20 years. To put that in context, Canada's is over 82. Most other high-income countries are in that same range. But the US is moving backwards. Why? Well, there are many factors, but two stand out. First, the healthcare system. The US spends more per person on healthcare than any other country in the world. Yet, outcomes are often worse. Access is unequal, costs are astronomical, and many people delay or avoid treatment altogether because they simply can't afford it. And secondly, and maybe even more disturbing, is the exploding crisis of drug overdoses. In 2022 alone, more Americans died from fentanyl overdoses than were killed in the Vietnam War, the Iraq War, and the war in Afghanistan combined. Overdose deaths have increased more than 500% over the last 2 decades. Let that sink in. Entire regions have been hollowed out by deindustrialization, unemployment, and loss of meaning, where drugs have become the anesthesia for a deeper pain. This is sometimes called deaths of despair, overdoses, suicides, alcohol-related illnesses. These deaths are not random. They're cultural signals. They speak to a system that no longer nourishes human thriving. And when the population is sick, addicted, and dying younger than their parents, it's not just a public health problem. It's a societal and a civilizational one. Now let's zoom out again, because the decline of a superpower doesn't just show up within its borders. It shows up in how the world responds to it. And over the past 2 decades, American global standing has really eroded, quietly in some places, more dramatically in others. For much of the post-World War II era, US influence wasn't just about military dominance or economic strength. It was about soft power, the ability to shape global values, build coalitions, and project moral authority. But that soft power has been steadily slipping away. The Iraq War was a major turning point. Launched under false pretense, it cost hundreds of thousands of lives, destabilized an entire region, and deeply damaged US credibility around the world. The war in Afghanistan dragged on for 2 decades and ended in a chaotic withdrawal that left many questioning not just American competence, but its purpose. And then there's the US unwavering support of Israel during the brutal invasion and ethnic cleansing of Gaza, while much of the world, including longtime allies, have raised serious humanitarian concerns. And now we're seeing tariff threats, protectionist policies, and diplomatic missteps that alienate allies rather than build trust. Taken together, these patterns send a clear signal. The US is losing its moral authority. It's no longer seen by many countries as the impartial leader of the international order, but as a self-interested actor trying desperately to retain its position of power. That erosion of trust has consequences. It makes global cooperation harder, especially at a time when we desperately need coordination to tackle planetary challenges like climate change or the advent of superintelligence or growing global financial instability. When the world's former referee becomes just another player on the field, the whole game changes. Power fragments, new alliances form, and the ability to shape a shared global direction weakens. So where does this all lead? We've looked at the debt spiral, the loss of manufacturing, and the unraveling of trust, and the erosion of soft power. But the real end game, the sharp edge of this unfolding story, is financial. And here's the core of it. The United States is now caught in a trap, one that's increasingly difficult to really escape. You might ask, couldn't the US just spend less, tighten the belt, cut some programs, and reduce deficits? Well, in theory, yes, but in reality, doing so would almost certainly trigger a severe recession. That's because government spending makes up about 36% of US GDP. A sudden cut would ripple across the economy, crashing markets, lowering tax revenues, and ironically worsening the very debt to GDP ratio it was meant to improve. In fact, the IMF has studied this and found that most attempts to reduce deficits don't meaningfully reduce the debt. Why? Because GDP slows down when spending is cut, which lowers revenues and keeps the deficit higher anyway. Also, the initiative around DOGE that started with the ambitious goal of finding $2 trillion in federal savings has already come to the conclusion that this goal is totally unrealistic. So what happens instead? Well, the US government keeps borrowing. The Federal Reserve steps in to suppress interest rates and avoid defaults. And to do that, it prints more money over and over and over again. This is how most hyperinflations begin. Not through reckless spending in good times, but through repeated attempts to stabilize a system already in crisis. Deflationary pressures build up, and eventually the only path forward is massive monetary expansion, which then flips deflation into inflation, and inflation into hyperinflation. It's what we saw in Weimar Germany, what we've seen in dozens of currency collapses across history. And it's the trajectory we appear to be taking today. Now, this doesn't mean hyperinflation is inevitable, but it means the structural incentives are now aligned in that direction. The system can't deleverage through growth. It can't afford to cut. And so it debases. And when a reserve currency enters that kind of phase, it's not just a national crisis, it's a global event. The end of the US dollar dominance would reshape the entire financial order. Trade agreements, lending systems, energy markets, global security, everything that's been built on top of the dollar begins to really wobble. Now, there's another important perspective on this. Throughout history, the collapse of empires hasn't just been about money. It's also been about power, specifically military power. And while that decline often starts slowly, the final unraveling tends to be fast and pretty dramatic. Right now, the United States is still the world's most powerful military force, with over 800 military bases scattered across the globe. Its presence is everywhere, from the Persian Gulf to the South China Sea. But the question isn't whether US military is still dominant. The question is, for how much longer can it afford to be? Because as the debt crisis deepens, that military footprint becomes harder and harder to sustain. In a scenario of severe economic distress and outright hyperinflation, the cost of maintaining this global infrastructure, bases, supply chains, weapon systems, personnel, could become simply unmanageable. And that opens the door to a cascade of effects. First, a rapid power vacuum. If the US has to pull back from key regions, either because it can't afford it or because domestic priorities force it to, other powers will rush to fill the gap. China, Russia, regional actors. And that shift could trigger new conflicts or sudden shifts in geopolitical alliances. Second, we'd likely see a realignment of global alliances. Longtime allies like Europe, Japan, South Korea, the Gulf states might begin hedging their bets, entering new defense pacts, diversifying their dependencies. Because if US protection becomes uncertain, they'll have no choice but to look elsewhere. And third, the risk of conflict increases. History shows us that moments of shifting power dynamics are often the most dangerous. The end of the British Empire saw flare-ups all across the globe. The fall of the Soviet Union was followed by regional wars and instability. A similar decline in US power could destabilize fragile imbalances, especially in areas where America has long served as the enforcer of order. There may even be a defining moment, a Suez Canal crisis of sorts of the 21st century, where the US is confronted with a global event and either fails to act decisively or simply can't. And when that moment comes, the world will feel the shift. Because military might isn't just about planes and missiles, it's about perception. Once allies and rivals begin to doubt your ability to project power, your influence erodes, even if the military hardware is still there. So what we are seeing is not just the decline of the US credibility or even its global leadership. It's the potential collapse of the security architecture that has underpinned the world since World War II. And this isn't happening in isolation. It's part of the larger pattern, the same one we've been tracking across AI, money, and the environment. So let's zoom out. We've now explored 4 major forces that on their own would each be enough to define an era. The rise of superintelligent AI, the breakdown of the monetary system, the acceleration of the climate crisis, and now the unraveling of the US global power system. But here's the deeper truth. These aren't separate threads. They're converging. And it's that convergence that signals something far more profound. Because this isn't just a time of instability. It's the kind of turbulence that precedes a phase change, just like the ones we've explored earlier in this season. Systems under pressure, reaching their limits, beginning to reorganize into something fundamentally new. And that's exactly what we're seeing across the board. AI is advancing faster than any regulatory body can keep up with. Our debt-based economic system is mathematically unsustainable. Earth's life support systems are being pushed past the planetary boundaries. And the geopolitical architecture that's governed the world for nearly a century is shifting beneath our feet. These aren't isolated crises. They're feedback loops. Each one amplifies the other. As climate impacts worsen, they strain economies and fuel migration. As debt levels spike, governments are less able to invest in climate resilience or AI safety. And as the US retreats, global coordination fractures, just when we need it most to face these truly global threats. We're living in what systems theorists call a multi-bifurcation point, a moment when many complex systems simultaneously approach critical thresholds, where small shifts can lead to dramatic, irreversible outcomes. And just like in nature, this is not linear. The transformations won't be gradual. They'll be fast, cascading, and hard to predict. If you felt like the world is speeding up, if you've sensed that something deeper is shifting beneath the headlines, you're not wrong. The rules are changing. The center is loosening. And what's emerging isn't just a new chapter. It may be a new operating system for civilization. This might sound a bit grand or overwhelming, but it's also what makes this moment really meaningful. Because the most critical thing to understand is this. A phase change doesn't guarantee collapse. It opens the possibility for breakthrough. In how we might move through it, how we show up, organize, create, and relate will really shape what comes next. This podcast is ultimately an invitation, not just to understand what's breaking down, but to begin listening for what's breaking through. In the next episodes, we'll shift our attention from the breakdowns to these breakthroughs, towards the imaginal cells already stirring within our dissolving systems. Early patterns of renewal, coherence, and emergence. What's trying to be born in this moment of global reorganization? What new forms are already flickering into view? That's where we'll go next, and I hope you will join me. For today, thank you so much for listening. And if this episode stirred something within you, I'd love for you to share it with a friend, with your community, or on social media. These conversations are really meant to ripple outward. You can subscribe to The Initiation wherever you get your podcasts so that you really don't miss what's next. And until then, stay grounded, stay open, and stay connected what matters most.